All right, so you want to be a wood sander, huh? Well, you've come to the right place because we're going to dive deep into RoleCatcher's insights and get you prepped for that interview.
We're going way beyond just talking about sanding. We're going to equip you to handle those tricky questions interviewers love to throw your way.
Sounds good to me. Let's get right to it. RoleCatcher defines this role as creating smooth and even wooden surfaces, providing a seamless canvas for further woodworking. So it's more than just sanding. What's the deeper meaning there? How do you convey that to an interviewer?
It's all about precision. It's almost like an art form. You're laying the foundation for something amazing, something bigger. Interviewers want to see that you get that attention to detail, that pride in your work.
Right, so how do you get that across, especially if you're just starting out and might not have tons of experience?
Well, that's where those specific interview questions come in. RoleCatcher gives a great example. What experience do you have sanding wood? Now, you might be thinking, well, I've only done a few projects in my garage, but here's the thing. It's not just about how much experience you have. It's about how you talk about it.
Okay, so even with just personal projects, you could still use those.
100%. Talk about the types of wood you've worked with, what tools you used, any challenges you faced and how you overcame them. Did you try different grits of sandpaper to get a smoother finish? Did you make sure to sand with the grain so you don't get scratches? Little things like that show you understand the fundamentals.
That makes sense. And isn't this where RoleCatcher's AI comes in?
Exactly. You can actually type your practice answers into RoleCatcher and their AI will analyze them and give you personalized feedback to make your answers even better. It's like having a career coach right there on your computer.
That's wild. So it's not just general advice, it's specific to the job you're going for.
You got it. It can tell you if you're using the right keywords, if your answers match what they're looking for in the job description. Even if you sound confident enough, it's pretty amazing.
Okay, that's super helpful. So we talked about the experience question. What's next?
Let's talk about safety. One common question is, what safety precautions do you take when sanding wood? Now, this might seem simple, but you got to go beyond the obvious here.
Yeah, just saying I wear safety goggles probably isn't going to cut it.
Nope. They want to see that you understand why safety matters, not just that you can rattle off a list of precautions. Talk about using the right type of dust mask for different woods, having proper ventilation, anything like that. If you've used dust collection systems, definitely mention that.
So it's about showing them you take creating a safe work environment seriously for yourself and everyone around you.
You got it. And don't be afraid to mention experience, even if it's not directly related to woodworking. Maybe you worked construction and had to follow strict safety rules. Things like that show you're committed to safety no matter what.
Great point. So we've covered experience, safety. What else should people be ready for?
Well, RoleCatcher highlights how important it is to understand the different career stages in this field. They actually outline 5: entry-level, junior, intermediate, senior, and even master wood sander.
5 stages. That's a pretty clear path. How does knowing that help someone in an interview, though?
It shows ambition and lets you position yourself the right way. Let's say you're applying for an entry-level position. You can still mention that you see the bigger picture, that you're eager to learn and move up to those higher levels.
So even if I'm just starting out, I should be familiar with those more senior level responsibilities.
It shows initiative. You could say something like, right now I'm entry-level, but I'm really excited to improve my skills and eventually do more complex tasks, and then mention something a more senior person would do.
That's a good way to show you're ambitious, but you're not trying to jump ahead too far.
Exactly. And this is another place where those RoleCatcher career guides are super valuable. They give you tons of detail on each stage, like typical responsibilities, skills needed, even salary expectations.
It's like a roadmap for your entire woodworking career.
You got it. And having that knowledge can really boost your confidence in an interview, shows you're serious about this. Now, speaking of skills, another question RoleCatcher points out is, how do you handle difficult or hard-to-reach areas when sanding? This is one a lot of people struggle with.
I can see why those weird angles and curves can be tough, even for experienced sanders. What's the trick to answering this one well?
It's about showing you're a problem solver, that you're adaptable. They want to see that you can think on your feet, find creative solutions.
So it's not about knowing the right answer, it's about showing you have the skills to figure it out.
Right. You could mention different tools you might use, like those sanding sponges or contour sanders, or talk about how you might change your grip or technique to reach those tricky spots. And if you have a good example, tell them about a time you overcame a similar challenge.
Because a real story always lands better.
100%. It shows you've actually been there, done that, which is way more powerful than just talking about it theoretically.
Okay, this is pure gold. Let's keep going. I want to hear more about these questions and how to knock them out of the park.
You got it. We've got plenty more to cover. Let's move on to another question that trips people up. All right, ready for a question that'll really test your knowledge. RoleCatcher calls this one out. How do you know when to switch to a finer grit sandpaper?
Oh yeah, sandpaper grit. Easy to get those numbers mixed up, but super important for getting a professional-looking finish.
Exactly, and they don't just want to hear, I know to use finer grits at the end. They want to know you understand the process.
So how do you explain that without sounding like you just memorized something from a book?
You could start by talking about the general progression, like, I use coarser grits, like an 80 to start with, for the initial smoothing and getting rid of any imperfections. And then as the surface gets more refined, I'll move up to a 120, maybe a 220 for that final polish.
Yeah, using those specific numbers, that makes a difference, right?
This shows you're speaking from experience, even if it's just practice. But don't stop there. Tell them why you'd make those choices. Like, if I'm working with oak, something hard like that, I might even start coarser because it's tougher. But pine? Now that's delicate, so I got to be careful not to gouge it.
So you're connecting the grit you choose to the type of wood and what you're trying to achieve. Shows you're thinking it through, not just following some set of rules.
Exactly. And this goes back to those RoleCatcher career guides. They often tell you what skills employers are really looking for. Like maybe a lot of companies in your area use a certain type of wood. Knowing that gives you a leg up.
It's all about tailoring your answers, doing your homework.
And RoleCatcher's AI can actually help you with that. Let's say you mention a certain grit in your practice answer. The AI might suggest, hey, based on the job description, you might want to mention how this grit works on it, and then it'll tell you a wood that employer uses a lot.
Wow, okay, that's pretty incredible. So we've covered grit. What other technical questions should we get into?
Let's talk grain direction. RoleCatcher says this one trips people up. How do you make sure you're sanding with the grain of the wood?
I can see why that's tricky. I mean, everyone knows you're supposed to sand with the grain, but actually explaining how you do it clearly.
It's about showing them you don't just know the rule, you live it. You could say something like, before I even start sanding, I always take a second to look at the grain, and then I make sure my hand is following those lines so I'm always sanding in the right direction, never against it.
I like that. Mentioning the hand movement makes it easy to picture.
Right, and don't be afraid to get a little descriptive, like sanding against the grain, that's like dragging a rake over fresh dirt. You just end up with a mess of scratches. But sanding with the grain, it's like you're smoothing out those lines, bringing out the natural beauty of the wood.
Okay, that's a pretty good analogy. I can see how using that kind of language would help you stand out.
It shows you're passionate. Even with technical stuff, letting a little bit of that enthusiasm for woodworking come through makes you memorable.
It's the difference between sounding like you love what you do and sounding like a robot.
Exactly. All right, let's move on to another question that tends to throw people off. Okay, how about this one? How do you make sure you're sanding the wood properly, without taking off too much? That's another one RoleCatcher says trips people up.
Oh man, I can see that. Sand too much and you can ruin the whole piece, but you got to get it smooth. It's all about balance.
100%. This is where your skills and experience really come in. You want to show them you have good control, that you understand how the wood works. You could say something like, I like to use a light touch, especially when I'm using those finer grits. It's not about speed, it's about feeling how the wood's reacting.
So it's almost like you're listening to the wood, not just sanding it.
I like that. That's a great way to put it. And you can mention specific things you do too. I'm always checking my work, running my hand over it to feel for any rough spots, any dips. I don't just trust my eyes.
Which makes sense, because sometimes you can feel those little imperfections even if you can't see them.
Exactly. And this is another place where knowing different types of wood is helpful. For example, with a soft wood like pine, I'm extra careful about the pressure because it gouges easily.
Right, so you're adjusting your technique based on what you're working on. Shows you're not just a one-trick pony.
Exactly. And RoleCatcher's AI, it can actually help you with this kind of thing. Like it can analyze your practice answers and suggest ways to add those little details that show you really get it.
Like having an expert right there giving you feedback. Okay, so we've talked about not sanding too much. What other challenges should we be ready for?
Let's finish up with one that really tests if you're seeing the bigger picture. How do you know when the wood is ready for finishing?
That seems pretty straightforward, but I bet there's more to it than it seems.
There is. They want to know you're not just thinking about the sanding itself, but how it fits into the whole process.
So how do you get that across in a way that's not just obvious?
Think about all your senses. Obviously, I look at the surface, make sure it's even, no blemishes or scratches or anything, basic stuff. But then you add, and then I run my hand over it to make sure I didn't miss any imperfections.
That final quality check, making sure it's really ready for the next step.
Exactly. And depending on the finish, you can even get specific. If it's going to be a high gloss finish, I pay extra attention to those tiny imperfections because they're going to show up under that.
Oh yeah, good point. Shows you're thinking ahead, considering how your work will impact the final product.
Exactly. At the end of the day, that's what makes a good wood sander. Attention to detail, a real passion for it, and understanding how it all comes together in the end.
Well said. And there you have it, our deep dive into how to ace that wood sander interview. We went over some tough questions, polished up that technical knowledge, and even showed you how RoleCatcher's AI can help you craft some killer answers.
Remember, confidence is key. Be prepared, show them you're passionate about woodworking, and you'll be well on your way to getting that job.
You got this. Now go out there, impress those interviewers, and show them what you're made of.